after the debacle in Norman, just how safe is Missouri's spot in the big dance? Lots of possibilities still remain with one game to go. Let's talk about them all on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And not only on the basketball side, but in the entire athletic department, KU facing some interesting financial drama. Plus, Kim English reportedly out as Providence's head coach. But as I said, lots of double bye possibilities still alive for Missouri. Of course, the Tigers are going to have to beat Arkansas. That's the obvious first step. But I'll get into all of the potential steps here as we start the program. But real quickly, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Mazda. Wins define the moment, putting in the work that defines you. Stay tuned for highlights in this week's Moving the Game Forward. There's more to a Mazda because there is more to you. And I got to say, you look at Missouri's position now in the big dance. I think Missouri missing the tournament is pretty unlikely at this point, but certainly the Arkansas game is still really important for Missouri. Now, obviously, hey, you look at where Joe Lunardi, for example, over at ESPN has Missouri. He has him as his last 4 byes in the tournament. So that means Missouri would avoid Dayton in the play-in games. Lunardi has Missouri as a 10 seed. And I'll just say it's certainly a must win for the double bye in the SEC tournament. But before the big dance, is beating the Razorbacks a must? No, I think it's just a must to avoid Dayton. Let's put it that way. I think Missouri is going to be in the big dance regardless, but obviously beating Arkansas would secure Missouri a berth in the NCAA tournament. I will say this, I think having confidence in Missouri going into the Oklahoma game, and not even so much that Missouri would necessarily win the game, certainly, but certainly put in a better performance than what it did. I guess my big mistake after watching this Missouri basketball team all season was thinking that it would be predictable. And the people who obviously are not fans of Dennis Gates will take that result as confirmation of their own previous position. I've seen a lot of Missouri teams over the years, including and prior to Dennis Gates, that had a lot of inexplicable no-shows over the year. So sometimes I think that's just part of following college basketball and a college team in general. Unfortunately, I will say this, if Missouri loses to Arkansas, the perception is going to be that the Tigers are limping to the finish again, much like it did last season. A big loss. Now, if the Tigers get blown out by Arkansas, I think that those people might have a point. So at the very least, I do want to see a competitive game, which is what I expected to see in Norman. It did not happen. Once again, what would a win mean for Missouri? Obviously, no Dayton, in my opinion. So you'd be in the field of 64, not just the field of 68 at that point. And certainly a double bye is still possible. And yes, you'd have actual momentum. Now, on that double bye in the SEC tournament, of course, Missouri would have to get a top 4 seed there. And one of the reasons this is still a possibility is Missouri has really strong tiebreakers. Of course, its record against top teams like Kentucky and Florida, for example, and its round-robin record, if Missouri gets into a big quagmire of a tie here at 4th place, something like that, well, it has good head-to-head results against Tennessee, against Vanderbilt, for example. And so basically all of this means is, while there's a million different possible scenarios here, first of all, the Tigers must beat Arkansas. That much is obvious. And then the most important thing to watch, you want to see Vanderbilt beat Tennessee on Saturday. If that happens, all of a sudden Missouri, again, if Missouri beats Arkansas, Vanderbilt beats Tennessee, all of a sudden Missouri has a really, really good shot to still get a double bye to get the 4 seed in the SEC tournament based on, like I said, some really strong tiebreakers there based on their record against common opponents and against top teams in the league as well. And if it does come down to a head-to-head against Kentucky or Tennessee or whatever it might be, well, Missouri has a winning record, a 1-0 record against most of the teams that it's fighting for there. So just an interesting thing to note there, that even after getting blown out in Norman, I would have assumed that it was a long shot for Missouri to get a double bye. But look, now that I've taken a further look at it, looks like Missouri still has a solid shot on it for the millionth time. Again, Missouri's got to beat the Hogs. You got to root for Vanderbilt against Tennessee as well. And then suddenly the odds are pretty good. And to my point on the Jekyll and Hyde nature of this Missouri basketball team, and not only just the extremes, but also you don't know exactly when it's coming. I thought Missouri played its best half of the season on the road, by the way, against Mississippi State. And then its worst half of the season on the road in Norman, both first halves. How do you explain that? I really can't. And I focused mostly on the inept nature of Missouri's offense, but the defense was pretty flaccid as well. Really, there wasn't much that Missouri did right in that game. Got beat on the boards by a team that is one of the worst rebounding teams in the country, as one of my viewers astutely pointed out. So individually, it wasn't anybody's best game either. I just, again, I'm not saying Dennis Gates is perfect by any means. If the people who don't like Dennis Gates probably think of me as an apologist, hey, I'm definitely a fan of Dennis Gates. The point here is I just don't know sometimes as a coach what you're supposed to do when everybody on your team is sort of seemingly a little bit out of it and not playing very well. Is that on the coach? I don't know. You tell me. And one other thing I'll say on that Oklahoma game, plenty of great seats available, in fact, at the Lloyd Noble Center in Norman. So just next time you complain about Missouri basketball and its support, keep in mind of how much success Missouri's had over the last 10 or 15 years and how many great crowds the Tigers still tend to draw, even when they have just a fairly above average team. But I will say this, again, nobody played well, I didn't think, in that ball game. So I'm not picking on Anthony Robinson at all, but Anthony, I did notice, fouls out in the game and is, of course, shaking his head on the way out. On one hand, he probably had a point on that fifth foul. On another hand, on some point, it's on you, Ant. And at some point, you got to stop fouling and picking up 4 or 5 fouls in every single game, no matter how many minutes you play. I'm as big of a critic of SEC officiating in basketball as anybody. But again, at some point, it's got to be on you. And when Dennis Gates was hired a few seasons ago, perhaps the most popular name among Missouri fans to be hired was Kim English. Well, Kim English ended up at Providence, and reportedly he is out after 3 seasons. So just in case you think it can't get worse, well, it can always get worse. I'll talk a little bit about Kim. Also, my love-hate relationship with predictive metrics this time of the year coming up on the program as well. But you know what? First, I got to tell you about Mazda, and this is Mazda's moving the game forward. For those who show, there's more to the score than what's on screen. These remind us of what it really takes to raise the bar. It's that extra work off the court, dialing in every detail, giving it that extra fire, that grit, and I never quit. And say what you will about the Missouri basketball team, they're unpredictable, but I don't think they're going to be quitting anytime soon. We put that same passion into every model. Highlights make the reel. What it took to get there makes it count. There's more to Mazda because there is more to you. Get Locked On Mizzou ad-free, by the way, with the Everydayer Club, plus members-only Discord access. Join at lockedonmizzou.supercast.com. And with Kim English not returning to Providence after 3 seasons, I have to say I was a little bit surprised that Providence was that impatient with English after just 3 seasons. It's not as though the Friars were terrible under English. The problem is the trend hasn't been great. Maybe English almost a victim of his own success the first season, getting a 21-win campaign, going 10-10 in the league. But since then, just 6-14 and 7-12 so far in the Big East for Providence this season. Now, the thing is, when you really look at Providence, you look at this new world that I'm constantly talking about in this podcast, this new world of college sports that we've been in here in the 2020s. I think it's really a tough adjustment for these Big East schools that are without football. How many of them truly can compete at the highest level? Your sort of traditional Catholic schools, I guess you could say. St. John's, for example. Marquette, of course. Georgetown. Georgetown, not a Catholic school, I don't believe. But the point is, there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of schools in the Big East that don't have football, at least not a serious Division I FBS football program. Obviously, Georgetown, Xavier, Butler, Marquette, Providence, DePaul, Creighton, Seton Hall, St. John's, Villanova. Only Connecticut, of everybody in the Big East, actually has an FBS football program. So the question to me, now that you have St. John's, of course, with Rick Pitino taking up, a lot of energy in the room. Obviously, the St. John's is doing well. Villanova is, of course, a classic program that has won a national championship in the last decade or so. You've got Seton Hall emerging a little bit. Creighton, obviously, is a solid program. Even DePaul is finally awakening a little bit here this season, it would seem. It's just tough sledding when you're sort of competing in that same realm, even though the Big East is not literally the Big East. When you have Creighton in there, for example, for the most part, you still have a bunch of teams in the Northeast there competing with similar geography, similar resources. I just think that was a tough spot for Kim English. I really do. I wouldn't give up on his career whatsoever. Kim English, a guy still in his 30s, I do believe. I'm certain that that's the case. English still in his 30s. Give him time. Maybe he ends up being a top assistant somewhere again for a while. And by the way, a career assistant isn't the worst thing in the world either. But I don't see that happening for English. I think he comes back from this and gets another head job somewhere. I think after being at George Mason for just such a short period of time, getting a power conference job like that was something he couldn't turn down. I think in retrospect, the Providence job, that's just a tough one for anybody, I think, in 2026. And Dennis Gates on Tiger Talk this week raised at least my eyebrows with one comment this week. Not that I don't have plenty of love for Mark Mitchell and Kobe Brown, but this comment, quote, "Between Kobe Brown and Mark Mitchell, I will be fighting tooth and nail for as long as I'm the head coach here to get their numbers retired or recognized." Well, first of all, retired. Here at Missouri, we have some pretty high standards at Missouri basketball anyway, really, really high standards for retiring numbers. Derek Chivas, the all-time leading scorer at this school, waited decades to have his number retired. Anthony Peeler has not had his number retired, for example. Kareem Rush, Marcus Denman, some other recent greats in Missouri history. I'll just say this. When it comes to Kobe Brown and Mark Mitchell, I have no desire to talk them down whatsoever. And in fact, I'd love to see those types of players recognized in Mizzou Arena. I have no problem with that. But to the idea of, if you're thinking about North Carolina, the Tar Heels, for example, in the Dean Dome, where I've been before, they have a bunch of names and numbers up in the rafters that aren't retired. They're just recognized. Well, for me, that's a little bit lame. I would personally either retire the number and hang them in the rafters, or there's plenty of blank space, I would say, in Mizzou Arena for having pictures, artwork of players from the past, greats from the past. Guys like Mark Mitchell and Kobe Brown would be perfect for this type of thought. I'm not saying this is a fully fleshed out idea, but again, artwork, photographs, anything. Yes, recognize the greats from Missouri past, great moments from Missouri past, like Ricky Paulding jumping over a guy for Kansas State and dunking on his head. That type of stuff should be memorialized in Mizzou Arena. I'd love to see that type of thing. So I think Dennis Gates is on to something here. I think he maybe went just a step farther than I would be willing to go. Now, when it comes to predictive metrics, as they're often called in college basketball, analytics, whatever you want to call it, but I want to focus on the predictive part. That is the word I really want to focus on here, because while I'm a fan of Ken Pom and all that kind of stuff, heck, give me all the data I can attempt to analyze here. But I think at this point in the season, at least when it comes to judging a team's NCAA tournament resume, I think predictive metrics are stupid, and I think you got to take them and shove them into a drawer for at least a week or two when you're actually judging who should be in the tournament, and not only who should be in the tournament, of course, what seeds each team's should be assigned. The season is over on Saturday. Forget about predictive metrics. We've got the entire season in front of us now. Now is the time to judge what has actually happened and not what we think is going to happen in the future. That is all, of course, subjective. The only thing we have to actually judge is the real results. Now, when I say, again, this is where I kind of have the love-hate relationship here. When I say shove them in the drawer for a couple weeks, well, once the bracket is set, get them back out. Because, yes, again, these metrics do have a lot of value, in my opinion, especially if you're going to be the type of person that's in a March Madness pool, something like that. And especially if you're like me, if you're looking for a champion who's an elite defensive team, these type of metrics, these type of numbers are going to be, I think, a really helpful guide for you. But when it comes to actually setting the field, setting the seeds, all of that stuff, I think it's, to me, antithetical to the entire exercise to be saying, well, here's what we think's going to happen in the future. No. All we have to judge on now is the results of what has happened in the past. Everything else is conjecture. What's happened in the past, that's an event. And coming up, KC, Kansas City, that is, its NPR outlet, well, had a pretty scathing piece, a very interesting and revealing piece at the very least, about KU and the state of its financial situation, its athletic department. In fact, a little bit of a conflict seems to be arising here between the faculty and the athletic department. And before you start cheering at KU's expense, which I don't blame you for whatsoever, this dynamic is going to be massive across the country, and Missouri is certainly not going to be immune from it. So you know what? Let's talk about that coming up on the program in just a second. But first, I do have to tell you about Game Time, because the biggest stretch of college basketball season is here, and Senior Day is here Saturday if you're a Missouri fan. If you want last-minute tickets, obviously the Game Time app is the best place to get your tickets. It gives the advantage back to the fans without long queues, no prices jumping around, and no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying college basketball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKED ON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. And by a 5-Hour Energy, yes, it's time for the 5-Hour Energy flavor draft with my number one overall pick. As always, I'm taking watermelon, the cool, crisp, and caffeinated beverage that, frankly, sounds like it has everything going for it until you realize, nope, it has even more going for it. 5-Hour Energy shots give you a boost with zero sugar. Find your new favorite flavor of 5-Hour Energy shots available online at 5hourenergy.com or at Amazon. So the interesting thing about, yes, the new world of college sports is that while I think most of us see there's a lot of pretty glaring issues in some way with college basketball and college football. Well, it's really easy to point to attendance numbers and point to ratings, for example, and go, hey, everything's great. What are you talking about? And to that point, it's a pretty tough one to argue with in the short term, but there are clearly some longer term issues for this sport and really just for the university and current college model that we are currently in as well. And I think Kansas is a pretty good example of this, and specifically the KCUR, the NPR report by Sam Zeff. I'll leave the link to the entire piece in the description of this podcast so you can check it out for yourself. But without getting fully and specifically into the details here, especially when it comes to Kansas, what my biggest takeaway from reading this is that every athletic department and university as well is suddenly having to come up with $20 million a year because of the revenue share rules, which came into effect the previous offseason. Every university now can pay their athletes up to, it was the house settlement is what it's been sort of colloquially, that was real easy for me to say. I'm not trying it again. What it was generally being called by the masses was that. And the $20 million, well, if you're going to be competitive, you better spend every bit of it, and probably 90% of it's going to be on football and men's basketball. So that part is not unique to Kansas whatsoever. That's a Missouri thing. That's an Ohio State thing. It's a Texas thing. Name any big power football, power basketball type of program, and they're going to have to come up with $20 million every single year out of thin air, on top of all their other expenses, on top of Kansas, by the way, refurbishing its football stadium, Missouri putting a huge complex on the north end of its football stadium. And by the way, one of the reasons this is coming to a head here in Lawrence is because there's a big faculty standoff with the university right now. Their union is wanting a pay raise, of course, and the university is being pretty steadfast here at saying, nope, you guys are going to get a 1% raise across the board, which, if you're paying attention to inflation these days, hey, 1% is better than a sharp stick in the eye, but it certainly is not keeping pace with the increased cost of living here in the past few seasons. Speaking of the new world we're living in, it's not just college football. We're in a new world of finance, of costs of living, and everything else here in the 2020s. And speaking of a new world, well, things change constantly. That's the one thing you can always expect in life. And another really interesting note here is that, according to this article, while enrollment is up currently at Kansas, KU projects a decrease in the future looming due to a enrollment cliff, or projected major decline in student populations because of a declining birth rate that began in 2007. So not only do you have that declining birth rate, of course, the increasing costs of everything, including tuition, which is going to be necessary to either recoup with bodies or an increased cost of tuition on the people who are continuing to show up. One way or the other, people are going to start going, wait a second, I can educate myself online for what cost versus this. This has been something that people have talked about for many years and even decades in universities and colleges. And eventually it's going to come home to roost. I just think we're seeing it right now. The idea that, hey, the birth rate's declining at the similar time when costs are going up for everybody, for the students, the parents who are sending their kids to these universities. And oh yeah, your tuition's going up, everything's going up. I just, at a certain point, something has got to give, and somebody's going to be left holding the bag. I just hope it's not me and you. Let's put it that way. So, hey, thanks as always for listening, by the way, to Locked On Mizzou. I have to admit, today coming into the program, today I was feeling a little bit off my game, simply because of the events in Tehran and around the world in the Middle East. This is not a political program. This is not going to be a blue versus red argument. I'll just say this. I'm glad I'm able to provide a distraction from the real world sometimes. I think hopefully that's what this show is. More than just a show talking about Mizzou basketball and football. I hope this is a show that gets you to forget about, the overwhelming stuff in life. Because I'll tell you this, I was listening to the radio this morning. There's a recent song, by the band Delwater Gap. The song's called How to Live, and there's a line in that song that goes, "I know too much, it's freaking me out." Boy, that one hit me right between the eyes, I got to say. I think a lot of people these days can relate to that particular sentiment. Again, it's not about red or blue. I'm a pretty relentlessly optimistic guy, but when you see events like what we saw today, the bombings in Tehran and around the Middle East, that kind of stuff, no matter what you think, for me, it's a real black pill for humanity, and I hate feeling that way. So thanks for joining me again today on Locked On Mizzou and putting up with my rant there at the end of the program. I will see all of you tomorrow right here on Locked On Mizzou.